So not all of the quadratic equations that you solve are going to be as simple as what you've done the last couple of days. It is entirely possible. We will be doing it within the next, we'll probably do it together on Monday a little bit, but I'll ask you to solve a quadratic equation, something more like this. Now, that's pretty hefty. There's a lot going on there that you have to consider. If it didn't have this term right there, it's a whole lot easier. But the fact that that X term is in there, it's not as simple as what I asked you guys to do yesterday and the day before. So what I want to kind of do is lay the groundwork for this and then show you kind of how to get. I'm going to show you the last step of the problem, and then we'll kind of worry about the stuff before that, because the last part's kind of the one that you really have to stop and think about. So what is happening here is I want you to stop and think of two numbers that multiply together, and I want the end result after you multiply them to be 0. Now, I can bet you any amount of money that you want that I can guess one of your numbers. Okay, now what I can't do is guess both of them, but I can guess both of them. So I'm going to say this one more time. Pick any two numbers so that when you multiply them together, you get 0. I know from third grade on that one of those numbers has to be 0. That's probably the first multiplication rule you learned. Anything times 0 equals 0. We're going to exploit that fact to solve some of these quadratic equations. Now, what's happening, kind of the man behind the curtain, is if these were binomial factors of an expression and their product equals 0, I know that one of those binomial factors has to have a value of 0. Now, what's going to happen is, well, maybe it's both, and I don't know which one it is, and there's some kind of guesswork on that. But the idea is I've got these two things, or possibly three things, or four things, or five things, but generally two things that are being multiplied together to give me 0. That means one of them has to be 0. It's actually got a name. It's called the zero product property. So what this says, plain and simple, is if I multiply A and B together and get 0, then one of them, A or B, had to be 0. I don't know which one. It could be either. It could be both. Has to be equal to 0. And this only works with 0, right? If I did the same thing and it was, A times B equals 6, there's an infinite number of ways I can make that happen. Right? A could be 1 and B could be 6. A could be 2, B could be 3. I can list it out and you start considering decimals and fractions and all that jazz. This can go on forever. But this only works with 0, where I can say 100% certainty that one of those numbers is 0. So we're going to use that to kind of help us solve some of these equations. So these are basically already factored. Okay, so this quantity here, x minus 5, times x plus 2 equals 0. That means that the first one has the potential to be 0, or, and I use that word or, not and, x plus 2 could possibly be 0. So what I should get are these two very simple equations that will result in two very different answers. So if I add 5 on both sides here, x can be 5, or if I subtract 2 on both sides here, x can be negative 2. So I get these two answers, x is 5 or x is negative 2. Now, normally if you were solving an equation, you would take those back in and check them. We can do the same thing here. If I take my original problem and I plug in my answers, right? Whoa, that's way big. My first time here, I'm going to plug in my 5. If I plug in a value of 5, well, that right there gives me 0. This one winds up giving me 7. I don't care about that one. The first one created the 0, so 0 times 7 is 0. It works. And then I do the same thing on the other end. If I plug in the negative 2 here, all right, I get 0 in this factor. On this one, I might get negative 7. And again, I don't care because negative 7 times 0 is still 0. So it's either the first one or the second one that's going to be 0. Okay, this seems kind of strange, I know, but it's part of a bigger process. Kind of like when we did factoring by grouping. It's kind of weird. Really only has this one little application, but it's part of a bigger process. So I'm going to do the same thing here. My first pair equals 0. my sec pair. My first factor, second factor equals 0. Again, or. So I'm going to solve this guy, add 8. So I got 4x equals 8. Divide by 4, x is 2. Or add 6. These numbers that we're getting are called the roots of the equation. Whoops, that was not right. Talking and writing at the same time didn't work out for me. The solutions that you get are called the roots. You're going to hear that word a lot. The quadratic equation has roots. That is where the equation has a value of 0. This here, because both of these worked out to be the same, this is what's called a double root. Okay, double zero, double root, double solution, something like that, because they both have the same value. So and that's going to be the case where, you plug in 2 and you get 0 here, you get 0 here, 0 times 0, 0. It's still, you're going to hear 0 a lot. All right, so what if, well, these aren't the what ifs. The next ones are the what ifs. Take a second and solve these. There's nothing really out of the ordinary at this point. Fractions are okay to get. Actually, you'll get fractions a lot on these. So the first one, I should get -1/4. And then you guys can do the math on that one. And then the second one, I get -2/3. You'll do enough of these over the next week or so that you'll be able to get to the point where it's factored like this and you can jump straight to the answer. I know that this guy is going to be +1/7 and this one is going to be -5/3. Okay. You might be able to tell just because of the numbers how this is working out. But if not, don't worry about it. You will get enough practice over these in the next week or so that it'll become second nature. All right, so these last ones I have here. Okay, well, I'll make one up then. I know that there's one on the homework that has a greatest common factor out front, something like this, the 2x out front. We did a couple of these in our last unit. So basically what's happening is you've got 3 factors here. So 3 things being multiplied together to give you 0. That means that there is 3 answers, 3 roots. Basically each factor has the potential to be what causes this thing to be 0. It's just not a binomial factor. These aren't big long equations to solve. Divide by 2, x is 0. Subtract 5, divide by 3. Add 4, divide by 2. Okay, so I get a 3-piece root here. Okay, I know that there's 1 or 2 on the homework that has that kind of greatest common factor out front. If that has a variable in it, that also has to be considered as a factor. If that is not a variable, if that's just like a 2 out front, none of this here is going to happen, right? It's only the variable portions that you have to solve for.